think it's all over to you guys. Good luck, everybody.
Yeah, I now invite the Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Sweet, just checking, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Great, thank you. 3 arguments in this speech. Firstly, explaining why we are likely to get these less educated voters. Secondly, explaining why you are unlikely to lose more educated voters. And thirdly, an argument about why this enables you to make better policy for a more left-wing base. First of all, a few notes of setup. The first thing I want to explain is what this electoral strategy looks like. We would think it would look like 4 things. First of all, it means when you are messaging about your policies, you would actively prioritize the way in which it impacts the interests of these groups. Second of all, when you are choosing particular messages, you would actively emphasize messages that are likely to resonate with the less educated voter base. That looks like maybe you would focus more on policies of economic redistribution as opposed to at the expense of policies more geared towards social impacts and social messaging, that kind of thing. Thirdly, when you are choosing particular policies, not just your method, not just messaging, you would do the same. You would choose to actively platform and actively emphasize policy that is likely to specifically impact this group of voters. That looks like things like the level of minimum wage, things like labor laws. All of those things you would emphasize at the expense of other things that privilege more highly educated voters. Fourthly, we think that we would actively choose candidates from this background who are likely to resonate with this voter base. Second thing I want to explain in setup is just this voter base is likely to be poor. This is important for the arguments we'll make later, but this is for 2 structural reasons. First of all, because education is expensive. To be able to afford education, particularly higher education, you need a lot of money. This necessarily means that people that opt into that are likely to be richer. But second of all, having tertiary education increases your earning capacity. And so that means that after you have been educated, you are also likely to be wealthier. That should suggest to you that this group of voters is likely to be poorer when they are less educated. The third thing I want to explain in setup is just to diagnose the way in which the shift from the info side happened, and we think it happened for 3 reasons. The first is that this shift towards less educated voters voting for conservative candidates came from a perception that the left and this kind of party had abandoned its values of rectifying economic inequality, and that is because largely they did sort of shift away from those kinds of things. But second of all, there is a perception that this happened because of elitism. It happened because the left was taken over by a lot of sort of highly educated high earners who made the values of the left more esoteric. But thirdly, we think the right specifically used those kinds of things to create messaging to less educated voters to suggest that they were the party for them. The reason that characterization is important in this debate is it should immediately suggest to you that this is actually a problem that is quite easy to rectify when you prioritize this group. 3 arguments then. First of all, why are we likely to get less educated voters? The first thing to say here is just that our policy platform is extraordinarily likely to appeal to them, particularly when we make the changes that we suggest in setup. That is things like emphasizing things like economic redistribution, emphasizing things like labor laws, and emphasizing raising minimum wage. In all of those ways, all of those things in very, very tangible and clear ways appeal to this group of voters who are likely to be poorer. They are likely to be working in these industries. They're likely to be affected by these kinds of things. When you platform them, they are likely to resonate with that. But I would contrast this to the right, who currently takes this voter base. They use a lot of sort of smoke and mirrors and sneaky messaging. Note the way that a lot of Trump endorsed candidates do that in the US. Our platform, by contrast, is far, far more tangible. It far more clearly impacts these people. Shifting messaging towards that means that it is actually quite easy to regain that voter base. But the second thing to say is that because this group has lower rates, is less educated, and because they are likely to have lower rates of media and political literacy as a result, just for the structural reason that often higher education specifically focuses on giving you these skills. When you do not have high levels of education, you cannot access that. It is easier to sway these people in messaging. They are more receptive to political messaging because they get that messaging often directly from politics, as opposed from universities, from journals, from newspapers, those kinds of things. That means that they are likely to be quite receptive to that message. The third thing to say is that, and this is sort of like following on from the setup that we explained as to why this shift has occurred, this quickly rectifies the problem, right? Because if the reason that less educated voters aren't voting for you now is because they feel like you're disconnected, immediately shifting that platform it immediately rectifies that issue, right? Now they no longer feel disconnected. The impact of all of that is just that when you pursue this strategy, you are extremely likely to get these voters. You are likely to get a far greater voter base, and you are likely to get elected. Noting that as a political party, your primary interest is just in getting elected. This helps you do that because it gets you far more voters. But I know that you are likely to care far more about these voters than other voters for a couple of reasons. The first is that highly educated voters are often clustered in cities, just for the reason that just think empirically, think of cities like New York and LA, or in Australia, think of cities like Sydney or Melbourne. Highly educated voters cluster there for work, and in most electoral systems, you are likely to get those cities anyway, and you are likely to win in those areas anyway. Poor voters, by contrast, are likely to be more disparate. They're likely to live in more rural areas because the cost of living is lower there, and that should suggest to you that you get different states when you pursue this strategy. That is why you would care more specifically about getting this group of voters. But second of all, if you do not claim this voter base back, and I know that this is empirically true, that group of voters is likely to go further right. They are likely to go to far right fringe parties. By contrast, like highly educated voters, even if you did lose them, we'll explain in a second why you wouldn't, but even if you did, they're likely to go for maybe more centrist parties, maybe center-right parties. But we would note that there is sort of a revealed preference of less educated voters when after the shift has happened, when they don't vote for center-left parties, they vote quite overwhelmingly for far-right parties. That's a lot of the way that Donald Trump had success. You would rather insulate against that harm than insulate against the small harm of highly educated voters going to sort of center-right parties for quite obvious reasons. At the end of that, we're far more electorally popular in our world. Second argument then. Why you are unlikely to lose more educated voters? A few reasons. First of all, more educated voters tend to care about people who are less wealthy than them anyway, and that's just because they have the capacity to, right? Like when you are not living paycheck to paycheck, you have the capacity to sort of care about a sort of like broader range of interests who are less tangibly impacted by policy, and that means you're unlikely to be pissed off by a shift towards focusing on poorer people. Like it is sort of absurd to think that like a lot of highly educated people will be like, oh shit, now we're prioritizing labor laws. That's terrible. Of course not. They often care quite a lot for ideological reasons about the poor. But the second thing to say is that highly educated voters tend to get their information from a wider range of sources. That is to say, newspapers, podcasts, talk shows, they tend to be more politically engaged for the reason that I explained earlier. And that means specifically messaging to that group helps less, right? Because they get their information from a lot of different sources just by virtue of the way in which education functions. And that means that the specific messaging to them is less useful than the specific messaging to this group of people. But thirdly, sort of the inverse of the mechanism that operates in the first argument, which is just to say that this group is less susceptible to messaging, right? Like when you are more politically engaged, when you are more highly educated, you are less likely to be susceptible to political messaging, and that means you're less likely to care about the shift. But fourthly, we would say that given the way in which education has been democratized over time, as the info slide suggests, these highly educated voters are typically young, and young people empirically tend to be progressive. They are more likely to be progressive, and that means that you are less likely to lose them anyway, even if you are not doing specific campaigning to them. But fourthly, wealthy people are less connected to the concrete impacts of politics. So things like minimum wage or labor laws do not actually affect wealthy, highly educated people that much. Or things like the function of government services do not impact wealthy people that much. That means they are more likely to vote ideologically and less likely to care about sort of small policy shifts and small messaging shifts that we explain. The sixth thing to say though is that education skews centre left. These people are likely to vote for you anyway. That is just for the reason that academics often are left-wing. Often, academia and critical study tends to swing left-wing, but also there is a huge amount of activism that occurs in university. All of that should suggest to you that you will not. There is literally zero opportunity cost to pursuing this particular kind of messaging, and that's incredibly important. Third argument then, this allows you to pursue more left-wing policy for a few reasons. The first thing I'm going to explain is just why centre-left parties are likely to care about this. First of all, it's just your ideology. Politicians tend to be altruistic. They tend to be more left-wing when they come into these parties. They want to pursue more left-wing things, but because of the way that they're currently configured, they're unable to do that. Second of all, this allows you to change that. First of all, because it allows you to just platform more progressive policy, more policy focused on redistribution. This is the kind of policy that these politicians likely would want to focus on anyway, but they can't because they feel it is not electorally popular. This shift enables them to do it. For all of these reasons, you get more voters, you get better policy. Incredibly proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the first speaker from side negative.
Cool. Just checking I'm audible.
You are.
Great, thanks. Biggest mischaracterization from this affirmative team is when Kat tells you that these voters abandoned the left because they thought that the left failed on social inequality. This is clearly not the case. Why else would they go and flock to parties, right-wing parties with Donald Trump as their leader? Clearly that's not acting in the best interests of social equality. Clearly there are other reasons that go to, and what we're going to prove to you in this debate is the actual trade-off becomes more about social policy, sorts of things that the affirmative team tries to weasel their way out of actually defending. First thing I'm going to do is a point of setup and explain what the actual trade-off in this debate is, what the affirmative team actually has to support. First thing I would note here is that highly educated progressives do support things like redistributive economic policies, things like universal healthcare. That is for the reasons that they are in line with the progressive views that they've been educated to think are good ideas. But notably, you already have these ideas in your policy platform. As a centre-left party, you already typically support those sorts of left-wing economic policies. Importantly, pandering to less educated, lower income voters doesn't look like adopting more of these policies because they're already within your platform. Rather, it is policies that are less culturally progressive because those are the reasons that those voters have turned away from the left. That looks like policies like low immigration. That looks like tough on crime criminal justice reform. That looks like restricting gay rights and abortion rights and feminist policies as well. And I would note that these are exactly the sort of policies that made them flock to Trump, made them flock to Le Pen in the first place. Because they're going to the right wing, it necessarily can't be an economic policy, right? Like Biden's running on the most progressive Democratic platform ever. It's not those voters that are leaving him for that reason. But I would note, even if it were economic policies that we're talking about, taking them at their best, the economic policies it's likely to be are things like protectionism or economic populism, because that's what time and time again, these less educated voters have told you that that's what they want out of economic policy. It's not expanding the welfare state. It's not things that are generally in the interest of poorer people. They're things that are specifically the sorts of populist policies that have converted these people to be Trump voters in the first place. I'm going to do 3 more points in this point on that setup. Firstly, explain why it's inconsistent with your beliefs as a party and a number of harms from that. Secondly, explain how you lose educated voters. And finally, explain why you don't gain less educated voters. So, mirrors the speech from AF, rebuttal will be integrated. So firstly, why is that inconsistent with your belief? First thing to note is just this is an active shift, right? And so you have a revealed incentive to do what you're doing in the status quo. Importantly, you're shifting off in many cases, as I described and set up, towards what Republicans or right-wing parties are doing. But even if it's not, it's just a shift away from what you supported itself. That's a higher burden for ACT to justify. Secondly, though, it requires abandoning some of the most vulnerable people that you care about as a party. These are things like trans people who are now going to be victimized by the sorts of populist policies that you necessarily have to support to get Rust Belt voters. It's like victims of the criminal justice system. And notably, this sort of stuff actually does piss off educated voters because they do care about the sorts of principles that you're now undermining. But thirdly, I would just note that some of these ideas are just bad ideas, right? Smart, educated people have decided that they weren't good ideas. And that if they're popular people, less educated, it's probably like these policies aren't as technically good as well. Which means if you do get in power and you implement those ideas, and then they go worse for your economy or whatever, you have to deal with the consequences that's bad for your next election. What are the harms of this inconsistency? Firstly, it's just principally inconsistent with your values as a party. You do not have an incentive to do this, or you just shouldn't do that as well because it's something that undermines the values of the left. Secondly, though, it divides the party. That is, even if the party leadership does this sort of thing, people who got into politics because they wanted to stand up for the sorts of policies you are necessarily abandoning, or they wanted to protect the sort of vulnerable people that this affirmative team wants to cast aside, and now are going to feel like that party doesn't represent them. They're going to desert to other parties, or they're just not going to campaign to the same extent they would have. Thirdly, though, and most importantly here, you just look really foolish in the media. You're seen as backflipping, right? You're seen as going onto the same grounds that the right wing has been doing for so long. And importantly, this is weaponized by the opposition. And if people are receptive to your messaging, of course, they're also receptive to right-wing messaging as well. Importantly, that makes you the party that's less tangible and more smoke and mirrors because you are now the party that actually doesn't have a clear message and is changing on those issues. So that independently is a reason why you're likely to lose all the voters. Let's talk about why you're likely to lose educated voters. Let's firstly talk about what they care about, because these voters that are often educated and are reasonably wealthy, as we accept from the affirmative team, but they still care about left-wing policies. That means they likely care about them on a principled level and aren't as self-interested in them, right? They're voting in many cases against their own interests because they believe that like more progressive taxation is fairer. But secondly, just by virtue of the debate, it necessitates a trade-off, right? This AF team tries to mitigate it away, but of course the debate must assume some marginal sway. where do these voters go? The first thing that they do is they vote for parties that are further left wing, right? So even if you don't go to the right, you now have incentives, and those parties have incentives to pursue them, right? And this is important because in many liberal democracies, like in Europe, like in Germany, you have large, powerful, far left parties are now going to take all your voters, which makes the left seem really divided. It makes you not seem like a good leader of the left wing. Secondly, though, they're likely to go to center right wing parties. And that means that what they're doing there, the reason they're doing that is because they're essentially giving up on their ideals, right? They're going back to self-interest because they feel like you have abandoned what they actually thought was the best idea. They're now just going to vote in your own interest because they don't believe that you have that principle high ground. But thirdly, and most importantly, they will just stay home, right? Particularly if they're the sort of young voters that the affirmative team wants to say that they are. That means maybe they don't lose them to the right wing, but of course, they just won't turn out in the first place. That means you just lose your base. You lose anyone who's motivated to go and support you. The other push we get from affirmative team here is that these voters read a wider range of media. So, that your pushes aren't less effective to them. First thing to note is what you say ends up going to most of their media sources anyway. But secondly, just other voters are more embedded in the right-wing media, right? If you're trying to win them back from the right, that means you have to push through all the, sort of propaganda that they've been exposed to, which is a much higher barrier for you to get through to them. What are the impacts of losing these educated voters? There are a number of them. The first is you lose a substantial portion of the voting base. They are a large, and importantly, they're a growing population. Secondly, they're the proportion that turns out to vote more consistently because they know about the importance of voting, because they have things like free time and enough disposable income to actually sacrifice a workday to go vote. But thirdly, they're just not as affected by things like voter suppression laws. A lot of the voters that ACT tries to cater for are. Fourthly, they have more money and time, which means they can actually volunteer to campaigning beyond just voting themselves. That means you get a more of a grassroots campaign on outside the house. But fifthly, they are more strategically distributed on outside the house. That is, affirmative team says they live in cities, but that's not actually true. Often cities are filled with less educated inner city voters. Look at Atlanta and Georgia, which is always structurally undermined by the amount of voters it gets. Actually, most educated voters end up flocking to the suburbs where you have more expensive housing. And at that point, they have more of a disproportionate voting bloc. That's really good. But finally, even if you didn't believe any of that material, this voting bloc is growing in the long term, as the info slide said, right? The more educated people that come, the more in the long term you are losing voters on this affirmative side of the house. And once you've made the switch, it's incredibly hard to backtrack on that. There's a lot of structural reasons why you can't do that. Finally, let's talk about why you don't gain the voters that they want. The first thing to note is you just don't have credibility in this message. These voters have already drifted away from you. That means when you try to backflip to get to them, you're seen as cynical. Secondly, though, given that they are likely to vote on cultural issues, why would they ever just accept a watered down version of the same sorts of conservative values that they're, like anti-gay values that they're already voting on? It's unclear why you would ever win that fight against the right wing. Or if you do, you're just pushing everyone more and more, right, or more socially conservative. That's not something you probably have an interest to do or would be good for this party as well. But thirdly, it just shifts both parties' incentives to identity politics rather than economic policies. Because of course, we're going to hear a lot of rebuttal at second affirmative, how that's not actually what they have to support. But I would note that just on a plausibility check, that is what you must support. If you want to gain the sorts of voters that voted for Trump, you have to do more of the sorts of things that Trump was doing. You can't just continue to do more left-wing stuff. That's what has happened in the status quo. If you want to keep doing that sort of good stuff, you should vote for side negative.
I thank the speaker for defined remarks. I now invite the second speaker from side affirmative.
The underlying premise of the negative team case is the disgusting characterization that lesser educated voters must be transphobic, must be bigoted, and must be racist. There are three reasons why you should immediately discount this characterization. Firstly, it's just unintuitively untrue because the info slide suggests that this is a very recent shift So the set of voters that we are talking about are voters that voted for Obama in the 2012 elections, but then did not vote against Hillary Clinton, which suggests that they were not as bigoted as they claim. But secondly, because this characterization assumes that people are just racist in a vacuum. But what we would explain is that the reason why there was an uptick in racist populism was because the GOP lied to these people, that what the right successfully did in the absence of left campaigning was to tell these people that the source of their economic inequality was minorities, that the source of their economic inequality was the left abandoning them for the elite. But all of that was a lie that we could easily counter at the point at which we started getting people and backed into the fold and ensuring that they were not betrayed, as we explained that the left has already done. The reason why discounting this characterization is absolutely terminal for this negative team case is because their entire case is contingent upon this premise. Like all their claims about, oh, you wouldn't, their trade-off between socially progressive policy and economic inequality is just hung on this premise. So if you believe this premise is untrue, you believe that the rest of this debate falls. But what I'm going to do now is explain a series of other ways in which this trade-off just simply does not exist. The first thing to say is that obviously what parties do is the ability to target your messaging, right? So there's no actual opportunity cost in terms of what you prioritize. Obviously, when you are proselytizing in areas where there are fewer educated voters, you would support things like economic policy. But if you are campaigning in Newtown or Sydney, you would obviously focus on the other items in your political agenda. This team has never explained why there is an opportunity cost on saying things to people in crowds, which is why this push from the negative team is farcical. But secondly, we would explain that there is a concept known as intersectional inequality, which means that there is no trade-off between economic inequality and racism, that one of the greatest vectors of racist oppression in 21st century America is the racism of capitalism that disproportionately hurts poor people. And notably, that is a very easy thing to sell, both to the highly educated voters and even to the fewer less educated voters, because all you have to explain is that all of you have a common enemy, and that common enemy is inflation. That common enemy is the cutting of welfare by the right. It is unclear why then this trade-off exists. Notably, we give you a series of reasons from CAT that just never get responded to that precisely deal with this issue. And it is damning that if the negative team hinges all of their bets on it, they fail to respond to it. The first question I'm going to ask is, can we get less educated voters? And I've already dealt with their claim about, well, in order to do so, you'd have to pander to xenophobic messaging. No, that is how the right has done it, because notably, the right never actually, what the right has successfully done is co-opted these people, never given them kind of economic policies they've done, but instead supported things like, cutting immigration as a potential solution to the economic problem. So all the right has done is baited and switch them, tell them, well, we're helping you because we're against the elite, but in fact have done everything to worsen that problem. What are the reasons to believe why we are successfully being able to turn left-wing voters? Their only real push against this is to say that, well, the economic policies that we defend must be terrible ones. Firstly, we obviously have feared as the affirmative team to do policies that in fact are in the interest of lesser educated people. Secondly, when they complain about protectionist economic policies, it's unclear why those protectionist economic policies are a bad thing. They assert that it is, but if it is, for instance, things that protect people's jobs, if it is things that ensures that the cost of living is equitable and people are not being price gouged by exports, those certainly seem like good policy ideals that would help lesser educated voters. It is unclear why that was a harm. But the key characterization that they never contest is that lesser educated voters tend to be single issue voters, and this single issue that they tend to vote on is on economic inequality. The problem is that often they are misled by political parties as to what is the best solution to that, which means that at the point at which the left is substantially shifting their policy platform in service of economic equality, that is what gets votes. But the second thing that we tell you is that, in fact, it is very easy to message. And the critical thing is that the left has a competitive advantage in messaging, which is to say that it is very easy to get these voters back from the Republicans because there are sound bites of Mitch McConnell saying things like, I don't support welfare because my grandmother told me that I shouldn't feed strays because they breed. So it's ridiculously easy for the Democrats to point out that they're the party that historically cared about them because of ties, because of a rich history of things like unions and proselytizing and campaigning for the poor and things like that. It's just unclear why at all we're going to lose less educated votes. So we obviously get that win. And notably, what we explain is that even if we only get less educated voters, that is still a benefit that wins us the debate. The only kind of push to this from First Negative is, it's actually just not true that more educated voters live in less electorally significant areas. Absolute lie. Like the fact that they live in suburbs may be true in some instances, but those suburbs are also the ones that tend to be, already get a disproportionate amount of the media attention. But secondly, we explain that in first past the post electoral systems like United States of America, rural areas are structurally disproportionately represented. So effectively, the votes of lesser educated people do have a greater effective vote in those circumstances. So it's unclear why that holds. But what I'm going to do now is explain why there's essentially very minimal loss. Even if you believe that higher educated voters are important, it's unclear why you lose them. I think the best push from First Negative is like, well, the problem is they won't vote in general at all if you don't give them a strong incentive to. But I think there are a series of reasons to believe why we can still provide them a strong incentive without, creating any of a loss to any of our benefits. And I think the crucial thing is you have to consider the context in which this debate plays out. Just say that in America, you are still able to get young, highly educated people to come vote for you because you say things like the Republican Party is an existential threat to American democracy, right? Like that is the kind of rhetoric that candidates like Bernie Sanders, like AOC already do. And that is something that is totally separate from this policy. So you can still do this independent of that because you are obviously still targeting messaging differently. But the second thing that we would explain is that there is simply no alternative for these people. Like when they say, well, problem is that they'll just bleed to far right, far left parties. That's not necessarily a bad thing because you form coalitions with them, because you still are able to get some degree of cooperation with them in things like the Senate. Comparatively, when we are talking about lower educated voters, they don't just not vote for you, they actively vote for the right who will not cooperate with you, the right who will do everything to vote against you, which is why we ought to prioritize higher educated voters. The last thing to suggest is that the last thing I want to deal with is their claim about, well, it'll be a betrayal of your revealed preference. But they give no explanation to suggest why the current preference is one that is in fact reflective of the party as a whole. And we will point to the whole history of literally every single center-left party in Western liberal democracies to be one that is formed from the labor movement, from unions and things like that, which suggests that the original values was far closer to our model, appealing to lower educated working class voters as opposed to their version. But the second thing to say is that it is unclear why the current preference is in fact a meaningful preference. When we explained the vast majority of the time, the reason why they simply abandoned economic policy was because the party was captured by elites that that benefited from that economic policy. So what this effectively is doing is ensuring that we are returning to our traditional values, and that is why on all those grounds we are proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the second speaker from side negative. Charlie, are you here?
Yeah, I'm just getting my paper ready. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this affirmative case is maybe okay in Australia in the sense that we are a very progressive country relative to the rest of the world. But ask yourself intuitively, what has been the highly successful platform of every right-wing party outside of Australia around the world? That has been pushing reactionary conservative social policy. And that type of policy has been extremely successful in winning over less educated and lower income voters, which should suggest to you that that is their genuine revealed preference. That is their primary policy concern. It's the policy concern that they vote on over and over again. If it were true that they cared about economic policy, they'd already be voting for the left. The reason why they vote right is because it appeals to them for their social policy. We explained to you why adopting those kinds of social policies is one, extremely short-termist as people become progressively more progressive over time, but also comes at the massive opportunity cost of losing all of your other voters and isn't even successful in the first place. Two questions in this speech. Firstly, can you win voters? And secondly, are you going to lose voters? They explained to you, we have two competing characterizations in this debate. Firstly, it's whether this looks like adopting more economic policy and focusing on things like welfare. And we tell you that it's more likely that you adopt conservative social policies, things like protectionism, things like anti-immigration laws, things like tough on crime stances, those sorts of things. You should believe our characterization for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's obvious that if it were all about economics, these people would already vote for the left. Af thinks these people are absurdly dumb, that they wouldn't have realized after just a couple of elections, the right clearly doesn't support them economically. Clearly, that is something that they just don't care about as much as the conservative issues on which they do align with more conservative parties. Second reason for this, though, is that just logically, education does expose you to more progressivism. That's for all the reasons that they tell you in Kat's speech. Things like you get exposed to progressive lecturers, progressive academics, progressive tutors, progressive people around you, having discourse about progressive social issues. All of those are reasons why those who have been to university are far more likely to care about things like trans rights and gay rights and immigration rights, more so than lower income individuals. Thirdly, it's because intuitively, like I flagged in my introduction, what have the right-wing parties been doing to successfully win low-educated voters? They are adopting reactionary conservative social policies, and that has led them to large amounts of success, which suggests to you that that is their actual preference and their primary voting concern. So then next, that aside, which I think gets us massively ahead already, I'm going to address the best case first. That is, even if it were true that this does look like only adopting more economic policies that are progressive and support poor people and setting aside progressive social issues. First response to this is that we explained to you at will, this policy doesn't look like things like welfare or things like raising the minimum wage. It probably looks more like protectionism. And the reason why protectionism is bad, which Brendan asked me to explain, is simple. Protectionism means you get less trade internationally that raises the cost of goods and makes life massively more expensive for people who are low income. And maybe these people support these policies. When you actually have to implement them, that means you have to face the consequences of doing so. And if under your time as president or under your time whilst you control the House of Representatives, the country gets demonstratively worse for all of these individuals, come the next election, they'll go back to voting for conservatives, which explains why this is a significant harm that you should weigh highly. The second response to this case is that it's unclear that it is so easy to convince lower income poor voters that this progressive policy, like more welfare and like higher minimum wages, is actually good for them. Firstly, because people are just more swayed by the media than they are by your ads, which means that they do things like continue to listen to Fox News, they continue to read articles from The Age or from The Australian, which means that even if you do aggressively push that these policies are good for you in your attack ads, people still consume conservative media, which undoes all the work you do to demonstrate why it's good for them through your advertising. But thirdly, and most importantly, it's because you're starting on the back foot. Many of these voters are convinced for genuinely logical reasons that things like a lower minimum wage is in their interest. They believe that if you raise the minimum wage, it would cause significant unemployment and they'd lose their job. They believe that if you expanded the welfare state, they would have to raise taxes on them if they're a middle-class voter. They believe that if you adopted progressive economic policies, it would actually make their life worse. I think it's ridiculous for this team to claim that conservative economic policy is so ludicrously ridiculous that there is no way that you could reasonably believe them they were in your interest if you were a low-income voter. Many of these voters are actually going to get actively turned off by your progressive economic policy because it is their genuine belief that it is not in their interest. And that has been their belief for a long period of time. And they still have that same media presence telling them that it continues to be against their interests. So even if it were true that this just looked like adopting more progressive economic policies, unclear that you can sway them. The third issue in this best case is it's unclear that lots of these voters The other issue with this is that lots of these voters simply won't care about your ads that explain whether economic policy is in their interest, because what they care far more about is your imaging. And we explain why your imaging gets far worse. Firstly, because your party seems divided. Secondly, because you seem inconsistent with what you've run in previous elections. And thirdly, because you get right-wing narratives about how you are tricking voters into being in their interest and sneakily getting in a bunch of work policies on the side. And this is most important to these voters. Firstly, because imaging is far easier to understand than looking in depth into policy, noting that lower income voters tend to have less time to do things like read articles about how policy implements them. They tend to look more on the face of things and what the media is telling them. And secondly, because imaging is far easier for right-wing parties to weaponize against you in their own attack ads, which means even if you do demonstrate in your advertising that economic policy is in their interest, that's outweighed by the downside you have of ruining your imaging by doing so. But then let's address, secondly, the real case. That is where you adopt socially conservative policies. We explain to no response why this is terrible for you. Firstly, it's because even if you do adopt things like protectionism and anti-immigration policies and tough on crime policies, Republicans are always going to beat you on this metric because they have all of those policies but stronger. Secondly, it's because you are now super inconsistent with what you've previously been running, which means that you don't have credibility on these issues, whether it's right-wing parties that have been running these policies for decades do. Thirdly, it's because this shifts things towards identity politics, which makes things messier and easier for conservative politicians to get ahead on things like being men, having charisma, caring about national pride, and those sorts of issues. At the end of that clash, you should see clearly that firstly, it doesn't look like adopting economic policy. It looks like adopting socially conservative policy, and that's terrible for you. But you should also believe that even if it were just about adopting progressive economic policy, one, that is likely to actively turn off many low-income voters. And secondly, even if that did appeal to them, it would be outweighed by the downside of ruining your imaging. Second issue in this debate then, do you lose voters? And I would note they basically don't respond to most of our material here. First thing they attempt to say is that you shouldn't really care about this issue because these people are all located in cities and you already have these voters. What's more important is trying to win rural areas. First thing to note is these rural areas that they're focusing on are getting smaller and smaller over time. So you should take the long-term strategy of trying to focus on the areas that are actually growing and actually getting more democratically represented. Secondly, though, is most of these rural areas are just unwinnable. You have no chance of winning over people who live in rural Louisiana, or even live in places like rural California. You're never going to convince these people that are in their interest because they've been captured by Republican voters for so long. Secondly, though, they attempt to say that this doesn't matter if the further left grows, that's not an actual harm. Firstly, it's untrue that they are going to vote with you in all instances. Often highly progressive parties are super principled and super stubborn, which means when you attempt to implement progressive policy, they do vote against you because they want something that's even more progressive. And you get a stalemate between the centrist in your party and the highly progressive people in the radical left-wing parties. Second issue with this is that in many systems, split votes mean you actually lose elections, for example, in first past the post systems. Third issue with this, though, is that it actively tanks your imaging. So even if they do vote with you, you lose more people to the center right because you seem like a divided party that's inconsistent. Fourth issue with this is you are center left, so it's unclear that you don't ideologically disagree with the progressive left just as much as you ideologically disagree with centrists. And at the end of this, with virtually no response, we clearly win that issue. We also explain to you why you lose many people to the center right with no response. Very proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the third speaking side affirmative.
Hey, can I be heard?
You can.
Cool. All right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The premise
of this negative team's case is that we must pivot to racism because that is the only way to win it. There are two problems with this. First, this is a policy actor debate. We have the ability to define in what way we would do this. It was bizarre when Will got up and said what they have to defend in a debate in which the affirmative team has failed. Second, this is hung on the characterization that poor people are not racist due to messaging or due to being targeted, but they are inherently racist, that is just their revealed preference for the reason of them being poor. That is the premise that you have to accept at the end of this debate in order to buy their case. I would say in the absence of rebuttal, that is a premise that is so prima facie incorrect that you must immediately write the negative team out of this case. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. First, what policies are we more likely to support? And second, how are we likely to do electorally? So we explain, first of all, why it is that this changes, why it is that your policy platform changes your policy. Kat gives you 4 reasons. I'm not going to whip them because they actually accept it by trying to say it will change policy into another thing. Kat also explains why it is that you likely care about poor people for reasons of ideology, for the reason that often people in center-left parties were originally more left-wing because you tend to get more extreme people involved in politics, but then have to moderate for reasons of electoralism. For instance, we'd point to Anthony Albanese or Bernie Sanders, who had to moderate in order to become more politically palatable. Their response is no, you will pivot towards racism. First response, this is a policy debate. We have fiat to define in what way we would do this, and we would not pivot to racism. And even if it was an empirical debate, if you have to ask yourself, in what way are you likely to do this? Do you think the center-left party has more incentives to choose to do this by pivoting towards racism? Secondly, I would point out that racism is simply unlikely to actually be what it is that poor people want, because this relies on racism being inherent to poor people rather than as a result of them being targeted by conservative messaging, because they are looking for someone to blame and when for their economic disadvantage. And when it is that the right wing is able to target them and say it is racial minorities who are responsible for your economic disadvantage, and the left says nothing, then that is why they blame minorities. I would say if we can set up, no, in fact, it is the elites in society who are causing this problem, that they would no longer be racist. And second, as Brendan tells you, race and class intersect. Poorer people are more likely to be from racial minority groups. Poor people are more likely to know people from racial minority groups. Absurd that they are more likely to be racist. What claims do they make? First, they say, you're still going to care about redistribution when you're rich because you're right, because you're left wing. Obviously, maybe they care to some degree, but like we point out that they are more apathetic about those policies because there's more disconnected. But clearly, when redistribution hurts them, they're less likely to be pro-redistributive policies if it is that they are wealthier. So they're much more likely to care more. Their second claim is, it'll be bad economic policy because it's populist. First, it's unclear what the harm of much of populist economic policy is. Like, yes, sometimes protectionism is bad, but also many advanced economies were able to build strong economies on the back of protectionist industrial policy. I'd point to, for instance, South Korea, who was able to develop their shipbuilding industry, which now is highly profitable using strong protectionist practices. Second, lots of good policy is just populist. The increase in the minimum wage, the increase in welfare benefits is populist policy that is good. Third, this relies on poor people being so stupid that when we explain to them why good economic policy is in their interest, they would be unable to understand it. Fourth, obviously, we would say that we would try and do particularly good forms of economic policy, and the left wing has incentives to push particularly good forms of economic policy. Their final claim is, if they would vote on sets of economic policies, they would have been voting on it anyway. The problem is we haven't been targeting them based on redistributive economic policies. We've been moving away from those issues. Our case is that we ought to move back towards them. Their final claim here is, you move away from your revealed incentive. Basically, this claim is the negative team. The negative team must be right because this is what you've been doing under the status quo. I would point out there's lots of reasons why you don't always do what is in your best interest, what is your revealed policy platform, for instance, for reasons of electoral expediency or for reasons of path dependency. So at the end of that issue, we had the fiat to define in what way we would do it. Poor people are not inherently racist, and poor people probably can be told that redistribution is in their interest. Now let's move to the matter of electoralism. I would say that issue, by the way, is overwhelmingly important in this debate because, as we explained, these center-left parties care about poor people significantly. The electoral issue is marginal, the trade-off between different groups. We just prefer to be better targeting the people that we actually care about. Let's start with electoralism. They say, you're going to be backflipping. This is an electoral harm. First, parties change their platforms all the time. It's not a huge backflip. Second, we're not talking about flip-flopping on some specific policy we've already committed to. We're just talking about a long-run slow change in the way that we choose to emphasize particular issues. It's not like they weren't for redistribution before. We're just pushing it harder now. Let's look at the issue of whether or not it is that you're likely to get poorer voters on your side. We explained, first of all, that we are on their side. Their policies just benefit them more. Second, we explained that they have a long-run revealed preference to be with the left wing because they say they're so captured by the right, which ignores the fact that this is a recent shift that they historically voted left wing. Third, we explained that they have a lower rate of political literacy and therefore are more likely to be targeted and to be persuaded by our sets of messaging. They say they're also more persuaded by the right-wing political messaging. True, that's why we need to counter that right-wing political messaging. The fourth reason we explain why we're likely to get poorer voters is that they no longer feel disconnected from the party because it is now specifically aimed at them. Their only response is, you won't be able to convince them that the economic policy actually helps them because they're so captured. It is incredibly easy to convince a poor person on minimum wage that a higher minimum wage helps them. And the way that I know that is that Republican politicians who voted against the minimum wage then went back to their constituencies, to poor people, and ran on them, pretending that they had passed those sets of policies anyway. Obviously, you can convince a poor person that giving them more welfare, that raising their wage is an inherent benefit. Now let's look at why it is that you're not likely to lose the most educated voters. The first thing we explain is that they often care about poor people anyway, and the structural reason is that they are less likely to have direct incentives to not have this happen for the reason that they are less affected by the politics. They're already doing relatively well. They're not living day to day on the whims of the political change. The next thing we tell you is that poorer people are that less educated people are likely to be less politically engaged, and therefore, that more educated people are likely to be more politically engaged, do more things like watch the news, and that therefore our messaging is a smaller portion of the total messaging that they see, and therefore it has less of an impact. They say, oh no, they're just going to right-wing messaging. This ignores the point, which is not about the distribution between left-wing and right-wing messaging, but we just point out that less educated people are less likely to engage with political content in general. That's why the set of people who do things like read the New York Times or watch cable news about politics are disproportionately the more educated people. The fourth thing we tell you to no response is that these people are more likely to be young, so they're more likely to be left-wing. The fifth thing we tell you to no response is that education's used to the center left anyway, so they're not likely to leave. And the final thing we tell you to no response is that they're unlikely to leave the party because they often don't vote on particularly policy platforms because they're not as impacted day to day by the running of government. They often don't do things like receive social services, and therefore they often vote more on the ideology or the brand, so they're less likely to vote based on this messaging. So we prove pretty conclusively you get the poorer voters and you don't lose very many of the richer voters. The final question in this then is, if there is a trade-off, which set of voters do we care more about? They say we simply care more about the richer voters for the reason that, for the more educated voters for the reason that's growing over time. First, I'd say this is largely stabilized. Rates of education in most places have largely stabilized. Second, I would say less people are going to university now for the reason that you're getting an oversupply of university graduates and they're seeing that there aren't jobs for them, so more people are pursuing trades. But we give you two reasons why we care more about the sets of lower educated voters. First, we explained that the highly educated voters are often clustered. The response is they live in suburbs. First, yeah, they live in the suburbs around big cities. But secondly, pointing out that they're clustered in a different area is not a response to the fact that they are clustered, and therefore we're going to win those seats anyway. The next thing we explain is that the less educated voters are more likely to go to the extreme right-wing parties, which is a harm. Who gives a list of they're likely to go to the center, to the left or the center right? Yeah, that's true. But that is better than the lower educated voters who might go to the far right, which is clearly not preferable for this party. Look, poor people are not inherently racist. Even if they were, we had fiat not to do this. Absurd case from the negative.
I thank the speaker for the final remarks, and now invite the third speaker from side negative.
This affirmative team thinks that the centre left is losing low education voters because they're not economically left-wing enough. But Bill Clinton won white working class voters while signing welfare reform that hurt low education voters. Obamacare was the biggest expansion of the social safety net in America for generations, but he lost low education voters. And then Biden ran on a $3 trillion stimulus package that was particularly targeted to low-income voters, including $2,000 stimulus checks to every poor, low-income, low-education American. And he did even worse than Obama with low education voters who just keep drifting to the right. This is not a recent shift, as Matt tries to tell you at third. Read the info slide. It has been happening for decades. And if the college was economic, there would be no logical explanation for it. The reason that these voters are going to the right is because their cultural interests lie away from center-left parties. And that is what this affirmative team would have to do in order to get to successfully be able to win these voters back. The first thing I'm going to look at in this debate is just the characterization. What does this shift necessarily have to look like? Then who you gain versus who you lose. On what this economic prioritization has to look like, I want to note briefly, Matt adds at third, well, it's an actor debate, but I want to note, so that, they have fair to say how they would do this. But I want to note, for reasons I'm about to get into and that have already come out up the bench, the strategy they are outlining is one that would not work, which means that if you believe it's purely economic policy, by the end of this speech, you will believe that it will not actually gain voters, and you still incur certain harms that we tell you about, like making your party look divided, like establishing media narratives of you as a flip-flopper, of not being able to have the credibility necessary. So even if it is, they have fair, the fair doesn't actually work. Why does it necessarily have to look like conservative social policy? Because they tell us it's all about economic policy, but structurally it is not. And we know this because these people shifted to start voting for conservative parties with actively harmful economic policies for them. So to believe this affirmative team, you would have to believe that because left-wing parties are insufficiently left-wing on minimum wage, low-income voters have flocked by the millions to right-wing parties who want to abolish it or not raise the minimum wage at all. And this is insane. These are low education voters. They're not fucking stupid voters. They would not vote so blatantly against their self-interest time after time over decades. So the only logical conclusion is that their actual interests have shifted. They have shifted from progressive economic policy towards social conservative policy. That is the force that animates them, that drives their votes in the first instance. And the response we get to this largely comes second from Brendan, who says, well, these people have just been tricked by conservatives. They still care about economic policy. There are three reasons why this is untrue. Firstly, as I flagged in my introduction, this is an incredibly long-term shift. If they have been tricked in the past by conservatives who have, lied about their support for things like the minimum wage, then why over the past couple of decades has that trend not slowed or stopped or reversed? They keep voting in increased numbers for right-wing parties, despite the fact that they still aren't doing anything for them economically. Clearly, that is not within their rational economic self-interest. So you can't accept that as a rational explanation. But secondly, if you believe that these voters are so susceptible and gullible to conservative messaging, how on earth does a messaging campaign from the party that Kat tells you has already abandoned them actually going to break through to them? How is it going to win them back? We hear no explanation other than the idea that they're susceptible. But we tell you that symmetrically, as long as they're susceptible to center-left messaging, they're more susceptible to center-right messaging, because that is their revealed preference. That is where they have now shifted for the several decades, where they have been inculcated in conservative media. But thirdly, even if you think that this xenophobia is like a trick that they have been there's been a sleight of hand by the Republican Party against white working classes, the white working class in the Rust Belt. Even if that is a lie, it is what these voters genuinely feel. It's why they shifted to begin with. So even though it's not optimal or logical that it is in their economic self-interest to vote for the Republican Party, the fact that they do feel xenophobia is a genuinely held deep belief, which means that they're not fundamentally racist, as Matt tries to say we have to support. It's just that they have racial grievances that have been targeted and exploited to make them vote for right-wing parties because they genuinely have socially conservative views, even if they have been brainwashed into believing that. That doesn't mean that their preference is any less genuine or strongly held, which means you have to appeal to it if you want to win those voters back. And I want to note this also deletes their push that largely gets dropped after first about getting better policy, because firstly, they never prove why this better policy would be better from the perspective of this actor. But secondly, and more importantly, we established that what this debate would have to look like for this affirmative team to actually win some of these voters back would be shifting not to the left, but to the right. It would look like adopting more tough on crime stances. It would look like moderating on civil rights for minority groups. It would look like restricting immigration. This is what the debate fundamentally looks like, which means almost all of the affirmative team's benefits fall out. But I'm going to be charitable. I'm going to take them at their absolute best and explain why, even if it is just economic policy, this affirmative team still loses far more voters than they gain, and they lose, far more important, strategically vital voters for them. So who do you gain? And I'm being charitable again here, assuming this is about economic policy, because if this is about social policy, all of the reasons that Will and Charlie have already outlined win us the debate by a landslide margin already. The first thing they tell us is that these people are receptive to messaging so they can be convinced. Three responses to this. Firstly, her cat's own setup and account, there is already a deeply ingrained narrative within these communities that they have been abandoned by these centre-left parties. So when you come back with a message, it doesn't look like you're trying to reach out to them genuinely. It looks like, well, look who's come crawling back because you've worked out you need our electoral support. It's not genuine. It's not accepted as real. And these people are very unlikely to actually buy into that narrative because that abandonment is a sense of, a personal feeling of abandonment. It is much stronger than logical weighing up of economic policy. No, the anguish they feel is going to outweigh them. It's going to make them far more likely to continue to support right-wing parties. Secondly, insofar as they're receptive, I've already told you, they're similarly receptive to opposing messages, calling you a bunch of cynical frauds, saying that they're still, conservative parties are still going to lie to them. Unclear why this is able to overcome that. We never get any structural reasons. But thirdly, we would point out that these people have already drifted right, which means they're likely already pretty deeply into the conservative media ecosystem that Brendan describes at second. And there's no analysis for how they'd be able to escape that. So clearly, to the extent that these people are vulnerable to messages, we structurally prove they are more vulnerable to right-wing messages, and you are better off allocating your resources to voters who are actually still winnable and not in Trump plus 90 seats in rural Wyoming or whatever the fuck this affirmative team wants to do. The second thing they tell us is, well, it's particularly good to win young people and young people who feel economically disprivileged. But the problem with this is, firstly, young people are infamously the worst people to try and persuade because they're unreliable, they're low turnout, they're not very geographically strategically distributed. Most of them are in California and New York, so it's unclear why you would actually be able to get benefit from this. And secondly, if it is in fact the case that, as I tell you earlier, that the characterization of this debate is being socially conservative, you are wiped out with young voters. But even if you could persuade some of these people to come back, and again, very dubious, even in a best case where it's economic messaging, because those people are likely already gone, weigh that up against the final issue in this debate of who you actually lose. We tell you there are certain harms because this is a backflip. It is an active shift in the strategy and the priorities and the values of your party that you've already held for several decades, which means you lose credibility. The media narratives are going to eat you alive because you are implicitly conceding that your current strategy has failed, that you have abandoned these voters, that you are in fact, a bunch of coastal elite, out of touch elites, and you've now come crawling back. That doesn't illustrate that you've changed. It illustrates that you're weak and you abandoned some of your core demographics along the way. Brendan tries to tell us, well, there's no opportunity cost, but that obviously deletes the debate. If it's just you can message different things to different groups, obviously we can do that. That's not mutually exclusive. Clearly, the debate assumes there is some level of trade-off. And the big push they give us is, well, a lot of these educated people will still vote for you because they're, scared of right-wing parties. But the problem with this is, even if they don't like the other party, if you no longer represent their values, they're not going to turn out for you. They're not going to volunteer for you. They're not going to donate to you, which means you lose out on a huge amount of actual ability to win those elections in the first instance. But secondly, if your policies change, obviously so do their priorities. If you believe that educated people are really wealthy and therefore raising taxes to pay for more welfare, why the fuck would you not lose them? Never explains in this affirmative team. Educated voters stay home. And even if they're concentrated in cities, that's where the people are, which means that's where the seats are. Land doesn't vote, people do. You get higher turnout in our world, you have voters with fewer barriers to voting, and you get the long-term trend of electoral success because you are the party that is actually able to get the voters who are not yet lost to you. And that is why this negative team handily wins this debate, regardless of which characterization you believe.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks, and I now invite the negative.
All right, cool. Starting in 5. First question I'm going to ask in reply is, what is the comparative, and deal with the insane burden pushes we get from affirmative. The affirmative case starts out fairly simple. That is to say that less educated voters have less money, so policies that help poor people must be popular with them. But we explain that if that were true, it would be unlikely that they would vote for the right because the right's policies also don't help poor people. Rather, it is more likely, as is factually true, that in most countries around the world, it is identity politics that has done that. The response that we get from them is, no, actually, it was economic reasons. They're single issue voters. But we explained down the bench that this is untrue for a number of reasons. Because it has been many reasons since, they might have initially been convinced by the single issue. They would have known that these right-wing policies actually haven't worked for them. This isn't a recent shift. This is something that's happened over a long time. But secondly, just to look at where does this happen in the world? Look at Le Pen, look at Hungary and Poland, look at Trump. These are voters that have been racist, that have been homophobic, and those things have, yes, these people aren't like born racist or whatever. They have been convinced by the right, and those are now many of the stances that are now palatable to them. Responses we hear from Matt. The first is to say that this is an active debate. And yes, you can choose how you support a policy, but our contention is that your model doesn't appeal to the groups that the motion requires you to appeal to. But even at your best, if you can make it about economic policy, we prove that this economic policy wouldn't win the voters that you care about. That is, this characterization doesn't have to be like a modeling question. We just say it's mitigation against the fact that they would ever actually convince the voters that they want to. Secondly, they say that we must think that poor people must be prima facie racist, and they cast us as offensive at every speaker down their bench. But I would note that we never said this. What we said is that it's more common that less educated people have those beliefs. That is because of the structural reasons we give, that education tends to expose people to progressive ideas. What we also do say is that they are hoodwinked by the right? They're tricked by right-wing politicians into believing those sorts of things. At the point that the left tries to capitalize on that, it incurs all the harms I outlined right back at first. So if our comparative is correct, it's a clear negative win. And that is because you look super disingenuous. That is because you internally divide the party and the politicians within it. But it's also because you just shift the scale of the debate onto identity politics, which you're always going to lose against the Trumpists and the right wing. That means it's unnecessarily like shot in the foot. You're never going to win the debate. But even if their comparative is correct, that means you can accept every single accusation of racism or whatever you want from this other team. Why do we still win on side negative? The first thing to note is all of their reasons for convincing less educated voters rely on the implicit assumption that being more honest and being more left-wing and just doing the right things that they actually wanted all along will cut through the right-wing rhetoric. But we structurally prove why that is unlikely, right? We prove that the right wing has such a hold over these voters that the left has abandoned them, that they don't have any incentive to actually change those beliefs and go back to the left. It will be a much harder job to do than simply convincing the voters that already agree with your sorts of policies to actually turn out to vote. But secondly, and independently of that, we tell you that the more educated voters are more important. And I would note that this debate necessitates a trade-off, right? You might accept at the end of this debate that affirmative team proves that trade-off is smaller on our side of the house, but there must be a trade-off. They get less educated voters. We say they're more important. Firstly, because they vote more consistently. Secondly, because they're not as affected by voter suppression laws. Thirdly, because they have more money and time to fund and dedicate their lives to grassroots political organization. Fourthly, because in the long term, where this debate is most important, they are the group that the info slide said is growing. But fifthly, we say they are more strategically distributed. Affirmative team only responds to this fifth mechanism. And yes, there are competing assertions from both teams, but overall, consider everything else. It's clearly much more important that these voters are on your side. And I would note, even if you lose less of them on affirmative side of the house, they are worth more. That is because you all the reasons I said, but when they vote for the far left, or they vote for the center right, or they don't turn out in the first place because you no longer represent the sorts of ideals or even economic policies that they care about, that is the point where you certainly doom yourself to lose an election.
I thank the speaker for the final remarks. I now invite the affirmative reply to conclude this debate.
The refrain of this negative team was, if lesser educated voters did care about economic policy, then why wouldn't they already vote for you? But we answered that question down the bench. And first, because we explained that the problem right now was the left lapsed into complacency, offered fewer economic policies because they assumed that the votes of the poor were a given. At second, because we explained that the party now was in fact captured by elites, which meant that the party became further and further distanced away from its roots, which meant that the question that you had to ask in this debate was, how easy is it for the left-wing party to return to its roots and to say to a poor person, do you support an additional increase in minimum wage as a solution to your poverty? Side affirmative relies upon shady pseudo-intuition pumps as a substitute for argument, but negative team provided analysis, and that is precisely why affirmative team are ahead. I'm starting. First question I'm going to ask is, what do lesser educated voters want, and can we give them what they want? Starting here, because the entire premise of this negative team is that the lesser educated voters are socially conservative, so to court them requires bigoted policy. But the problem is that as we identify a third, to the extent that some lesser educated voters are in fact socially conservative, those were the set of people we, as the affirmative team, by virtue of fiat, wouldn't seek out, which meant that the burden of the negative team is to insist to you that the vast majority of lesser educated people were in fact bigoted. And the first thing to establish here is that none of their proof was sufficient to prove this claim. That the right shifted to this. No explanation as to why that shift was in fact the reason for why these people voted for the right. They say, well, why did fewer educated voters persist with the right? No explanation to suggest that this division genuinely reflected their interest. By contrast, what we explained from second affirmative and at first was that problems of racism were constructed by right-wing propaganda, that what the right successfully did was a bait and switch policy where they said, you are concerned about economic anxieties and things like minimum wage, but the problem was immigrants or minorities as opposed to the failure of the capitalistic elite. That was the narrative that the affirmative team brought to you. It was far more plausible and analyzed. And there were two other reasons that we gave. That firstly, that third, the lower educated voters are disproportionately belong to oppressed minorities. So identity politics arguments were in fact persuasive to them. So given that that is what the vast majority of less educated voters want, can we give them to them? They provide two responses to explain why we can't. None of them was sufficient. The first thing they say is, well, the problem is they already feel betrayed. Why would they come back to you? We explain that at best, this is a counter assertion. Perhaps you are more welcome to come back to you because you feel gratified, you finally get acknowledged. Both these scenarios are equally plausible. It's never explained as to why which is the predominant one. But as we explained, it is in fact remarkably easy for them to get back to vote because they did vote for you 4 years ago. And historically, there are people that tend to flip-flop around parties, which suggests that they are not so intractable. The second thing they say is, well, the problem is, it is many of these people buy into conservative economic policies. Why would they ever vote for you? That is a problem in the status quo where the only party proselytizing to them was the right. The easiest fix to that is to offer them an alternative solution to which they might be more persuaded by, the solution that is more geared towards their economic situation rather than pandering on racist tropes. So clearly, we were the side that was more effectively able to gain the votes of lesser educated voters. And we give you two reasons to suggest why that is more important, even if you lose the higher educated votes. The first reason is ironically given to you by first negative reply, which is that, well, more educated voters are more consistent. Precisely. That is why they will vote for you anyway. But we give you two other reasons that they never respond to. The first is that higher educated voters are more concentrated, and in context of past the post electoral systems, their vote matters less than lesser educated voters who live in fragmented rural areas whose structures are disproportionately represented. But secondly, we explain that it is far more costly per party for you to lose a lesser educated voter to the far right than it is for you as the Labour Party to lose a vote to the Greens. And they never, ever get past that line of argumentation, which is why you must give it to the affirmative team.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I thank all debaters for an exceedingly excellent debate.